Continuing the theme of a power shift and examining who is in charge, our next speaker is Clay Shirky, who again I'm really excited to be able to introduce. At previous Zeitgeist, we had James Surowiecki of The New Yorker and of The Wisdom of Crowds talk about how collective intelligence made a difference in how the world worked, and the internet had made this possible. Certainly it has made Google and many other companies possible. And I think if that was the wisdom of crowds, Clay Shirky is going to talk about the actions of crowds and how we can understand them. He's on the faculty of the Interactive Telecom program at NYU. I think of him as one of the sanest voices in technology policy and its interaction with social and political life that there is. It's hard to strike the balance between unreasonable pessimism and unreasonable optimism, but Clay Shirky consistently does it. Please join me in welcoming Clay Shirky.
Thanks very much.
There you go.
Thanks very much. Thank you. So I wrote a book that came out this spring called Here Comes Everybody. And the thesis of the book in 5 words is group action just got easier. What I looked at was the ways in which all of our new network technologies, the internet, mobile phones, applications built on top of them, are changing the way groups come together and get things done. Now, you got that book in your swag bag, so I'm not going to talk about that this morning, but it is the theme I'm working from, very much exemplified by Jennifer's talk before the break. What I want to talk about today is something I've been thinking about since then, which is the role of inconvenience in the design of social systems. So let's start here. So here we have a photo, 2 athletic young men pursuing a basketball. Now this is curious because these guys are quite well paid, right? And you would think that one or the other of them would have had the common sense to go by a sporting goods store on the way to the game and buy a second basketball so they didn't have to spend the whole hour fighting over this one. Right? In fact, right, these guys have got enough money. Maybe we could just get a basketball for every member of both teams. It's only about $50 a piece. But of course, this is a ridiculous idea. The design of basketball requires inconvenience to function. That's how it works. It needs scarcity. It fails with abundance. So hold that thought. I want to tell you about something that happened to a friend of mine. Last November, a former student of mine who's gone on to become a colleague and a friend broke off her engagement with her longtime fiancé. And in addition to all of the sort of emotional horror and administrative trivia that you have to go through when something like that happens, she also had to engage in the 21st century ritual of the changing of the relationship status. Right? She had to go onto Facebook and she had to change her relationship status from engaged to single. Right? Because what she didn't want to have happen is she didn't want to have the news that she had broken up with her fiancé show up on the Facebook news feed. Right. Her problem was that she had a lot of friends on Facebook, but she also had a lot of friends, which is to say people she'd gone to high school with, people she knew from 2 jobs ago, all of the rest of them. Right. And having it show up in this environment, having that be the way she tells people, right, something she really wanted to avoid. Even worse, many of her recently former fiancé's friends had also friended her, and she especially didn't want them to find out this way, right? Because that would be a terrible thing to do. And so, right, in order to perform this changing of the relationship status, she goes onto Facebook and she finds this, which is Facebook's privacy policy. Very well thought out, very clearly stated. Then she goes here, which is the interface for managing privacy preferences. She reads the privacy policy, she reads the instructions, she goes to the interface, she checks the appropriate checkboxes, and finally she can do it. And she goes through and she changes her status. I'm not seeing the next slide. There it is. From engaged back to single, and presses the button. 2 seconds later, absolutely everybody in her contact list got in their newsfeed, right? Your friend just changed her relationship status from engaged to single. Total privacy wipeout, complete disaster, exactly the opposite effect of the one she wanted to create. Her email started going off, IM, Twitter, the same thing was happening to her former fiancé. Suddenly, everybody knew all at once. So the question we want to ask in situations like that is, who's at fault? What went wrong? How did this happen, right? So one answer is, right, my friend's at fault, right? She didn't really understand Facebook. She did her graduate thesis work on a comparison of Friendster, Facebook, and Meetup, right? If she doesn't get social networks, it's well beyond, right, the average user, right? So then you say, well, Facebook is at fault, right? This privacy policy isn't clear, the interface isn't clear, something went wrong there. James Grimmelman, who writes about privacy and social networks at New York Law School, has said that Facebook has the best privacy policy of any social network service he's ever looked at. What went wrong here is that changing your relationship status in a simple and binary way is an unnatural act, right? We're simply no good at having anything called privacy preferences at all. In fact, prior to the current era, the only person any of us even knew of who had anything that could be called privacy preferences was Greta Garbo. Right? Right? And now, suddenly, all of us have to manage this set of checkboxes. Right? Prior to the current era, the principal guarantor of privacy wasn't law and regulation, and it wasn't engineering and software. It was inconvenience. That's what kept us safe. Right? We lived most of our lives not in private or in public at sort of two extreme ends. We lived most of our lives in a sphere that we called personal life, a word we hardly use anymore except, sorry about this, a word we hardly use anymore except with reference to technology, right? In personal life, right, you could walk around talking to your friend. In public, yes, but it wasn't like anybody was spying on you, and it wasn't like every word you uttered was being recorded for all time. And now it is like that. It's a lot like that. And for people like my friend, a significant piece of their social life is like that. Right? With privacy, we're not moving from an old engineered system to a new engineered system. We're moving from an evolved system, primarily based on the inconvenience of the real world, into a system that's engineered, and we have to figure out how to put the inefficiency back, right? That's the question. There is no amount of formal management of single checkbox yes or no privacy preferences that's going to accommodate our need for privacy as we've lived it. Right? And as I've looked around after finishing the book and started looking at social systems as they're adapting, I see this pattern over and over again. Places where, for the system to work, we have to have a certain kind of inefficiency. There was a moment shortly after Friendster launched, the original breakout social networking service, where young teenagers who weren't allowed to join the service nevertheless joined in droves. But there was no place for them to list their age because they weren't supposed to be there. So 16-year-olds listed their age as 66. Right, 14-year-olds listed their age as 64. Everybody was in on the joke, and you could start to sort of look through the system. And because Friendster was designed to increase the searchability of the system, right? How many friends do you have? How easy is it to find them? Right? The combination of those two factors meant we came this close to having an effective search engine for 14-year-old girls. We don't want a search engine for 14-year-old girls. We don't want that for a lot of really good reasons. And that's now obviously widely understood in the social networking service. But the general case is that there are some kinds of inefficiency we have to have. And that the design of inefficiency in the digital environment becomes one of the big social challenges of the age. Here's another example taken from another domain. Whoops. Back please, thank you. So this is Chris Avenir. He's an 18-year-old, and because he's 18, he's grown up in this environment. Right? When he was 5, the commercial web, there was already public access to the internet. When he was 10, the commercial web was already well on its way to being built out. By the time he was 15, Friendster, MySpace, Facebook had all launched. Before he was 20, he goes to college. Right? When he gets to college, right, he sets up a study group for his chemistry class, as students have done since time immemorial. But because he's the age he is, he sets up the study group on Facebook. Right? He calls it the dungeon / Ryerson College chemistry. Right? And it goes pretty well. Right? He gets 146 of his fellow students to join his chemistry study group. They start talking about chemistry. Right? And there they are on Facebook. And all of a sudden, the college calls him up on charges and threatens to expel him. How many charges? 147 charges. One for setting up the Facebook group, and one for each student who joined. Right? They said, you can't do this. This is a complete violation of the academic code of conduct. You must come down and defend yourself. Right? So here's Ryerson's point of view. Right? What you are doing is publishing. Right? What you are doing is breaking out of the environment of the college. You are operating as if you owned a television station, a printing press, or whatever. Right? Here's Avenue's point of view. Right? He's hiding nothing, right? He's doing this out in the open on Facebook. And not just that. He called his study group the Dungeon because that's the name of the room on the Ryerson campus where study groups meet. From his point of view, right, this was simply taking real-world kinds of engagement and moving it onto the web. Right? And so you have this either-or argument, right? Is Facebook like a newspaper, or is Facebook like a study room? But metaphor is our great enemy here, because if you have to answer either of those questions, you'll get it wrong, right? Because it turns out that Facebook is a lot like Facebook, right? That it does different things than any other system. In fact, if it didn't do that, they wouldn't have a business model at all. And it is exactly in the ways that it differs that means there is no obvious choice from previous experience about what to do in this example. So clearly, right, Avenir embarrassed Ryerson. Clearly they overreacted. Clearly they're bad actors here. The story had a moderately happy ending. He was graded down for the chemistry class, but not expelled, which in my view was even still a little too far. Ryerson going a little too far. But there is a deeper principle at work here. Right? What did Avenir do that upset Ryerson so much? And what he did is that by being given control of convening large groups, he caused the two messages that exist inside educational institutions to collide with one another. Right? Colleges have an inside message and an outside message. The inside message is, welcome to the community of scholars. We are a discursive environment. The ideal kind of class to be in is a small seminar where you discuss things with your peers. It's about conversation. It's about community. The outside message from a college is quality control of individual minds, right? We take students, we fill their brains with the information they need, the experiences they need. When they're ready, we slap a diploma on them and ship them to you, right? And the thing that kept those two messages from colliding is inconvenience in the real world, right? And so as long as that happens, the inside message and the outside message don't clash. And what Avenir did was just run Facebook right through that distinction. But just because Ryerson College is the bad actor here doesn't mean that this is a simple case of do as thou wilt as the whole of the law. Because here's the thing. There may be tables down in the dungeon at Ryerson, but there's no tables that seat 146, right? If you've got a group of half a dozen people who come together for a study group, and somebody shows up and says, look, I'm just here to free ride on you guys, right? I just want you to tell me how to pass the test, but I'm not going to participate, right? That person gets kicked out. Small groups are really good at defending themselves against free riders. Large groups are not, right? And in particular, the logic of digital networks is to reduce the harm of free riders rather than to reduce the threat of free riders. In fact, many of our most important systems, starting with Napster, are free rider tolerant. Right? But colleges can't afford to build an educational experience around tolerance of free riders any more than you could have a good game of basketball with an abundance of basketballs. Right? We need some way to ensure that participants in a group are actually participating. And there's no way in a group of 146 people that some of those people weren't just in there essentially shoulder surfing for the answers to the chemistry test. Right? And that doesn't even bring into account search engines, Because next year, all someone would have to do is just type in Ryerson Chemistry Study Group and get all of the conversation without even joining the group, right? And so instead of saying we're going to take this principle from the 20th century or that principle from the 20th century, or in the case of education, from the 12th century, what has to happen is we have to figure out what kind of inefficiency is going to produce the right balance between individual and group effort in educational institutions. There's no simple porting of old principles to take this example into account. We don't have many good examples of places where people have figured this out. But we do have one. Actually, let's go back from this for a minute. Sorry. We do have one. And this is a story that starts in 1980, when Xerox delivers the most important printer in the world. Right? The most important printer in the world was the 9700. It was part of the first model of laser printers. But it wasn't important for what it did. It was important for where it went and what it had when it got there. Because where it went was the MIT lab where Richard Stallman was a student, and what it had when it got there was no source code, right? And Richard Stallman, a programmer of the first rank, saw that printer, and he saw the future. He said, if this continues this way, it is the end of the community of sharing that I know and love. Right? It is the end of programmers sharing their knowledge. And so, another momentous anniversary. 25 years ago this year, he founded the Free Software Foundation. The Free Software Foundation added the GNU public license, otherwise called the GPL. And the GPL is specifically designed to inject a certain kind of inefficiency into the act of sharing software. Right? It is inefficiency as flow control. It says programmers who abide by these rules can share, and programmers who don't abide by these rules are prohibited from sharing in certain ways. Right? It is the kind of inefficiency that increases the social density of the community of participants. Right? And it's not just the GPL, and it's not just software now, because the intellectual heritage of this is quite extraordinary. Right? All of the Creative Commons licenses for content, right, have brought this model to all kinds of intellectual production. Right? And so we talk a lot about the really massive scale versions of this. Linux, the Apache web server, Wikipedia. And these are all huge and deserving of attention. But that's not the stuff that winds me up. Oh, I'm sorry, go back. That's not the stuff that winds me up. Here's what gets me, right? You can go out on the web and find pages devoted to the Lego figurine modding community, right? It's not just for people who collect Lego figurines, it's for people who collect them and then modify them to use in particular kinds of Lego dioramas, right? And those people will share with you, right, as long as you credit them, right? You can go out to the homeschooling community, people we think of as removing themselves from society, and you'll see incredible curriculum sharing. You'll see used textbook networks. There's an incredible amount of sharing going on in these models. And all of that derives from the intellectual heritage of the GPL. But now that the network is becoming so important, we're seeing a rise not just in intellectual production, but in collective action. Right? Here we have a Facebook group protesting banks' treatment of students. Right? Here we have a group of Belarusian kids protesting against the Lukashenko government, using LiveJournal, using digital photography for sharing after the event. Right? Here we have 40,000 kids walking out of the LA Unified School District to protest anti-immigrant policies. A protest organized in 48 hours entirely by MySpace and SMS. Right? But here's a curious thing. Right? We've got all of this fecundity in intellectual production, and we've got this rise of collective action. But all of the collective action examples we have rely on stop energy. Right? There's a huge number of protest movements. I should say not all, but the preponderance of them. Right? There's a huge premium on short-term, high-visibility protests in collective action. Right? So what's the gap? And here's what I think the gap is. There is no GPL for group action. There is no license yet for collective action that allows groups to come together and work together over long periods of time around goals related to collective action rather than just intellectual production. Do this thought experiment. Assume you and a couple dozen friends, neighbors, decide you're going to do something to lower the carbon footprint of your neighborhood or town. And you go down to a bank and you say, hey, right, we all like each other, we all share the same goals, why don't you give us a bank account? Right? The bank will laugh at you and send you out of the room. Right? If you go away and incorporate in Delaware and come back and say, we're a corporation, now give us a bank account, the bank says, okay, sign here. Right? The act of incorporating, literally of embodying the group, injects 4 kinds of inconvenience into that group. The group is hard to set up, it's hard to tear down, it's hard to join, and it's hard to leave. And once you do that, the state is willing to defer to the group as a real entity. Right? And that's what I think is coming now. Right? There are lots of examples of people experimenting with how you do this. There is, let me bang through this. These are in fact the... In Britain, there's something called a community interest company. Right? And a community interest company is a way of starting a for-profit entity that has social goals built into the charter. Right? Vermont has become the first state in the Union to add something called the virtual corporation. You can form a company in Vermont without having to have paper filings, a physical address, or a hierarchical management structure. And doesn't that sound friendly to net native groups? Right? Vermont is trying to be the Delaware of cyberspace. Right? The Meetup is creating something called the Meetup Alliance, which allows bunches of local real-world groups to coordinate their actions on regional and national scale. Now, I can't tell you which of these examples might succeed, but I can tell you this. The premium for and the effect of getting this right are both going to be enormous. Right? Because once we have groups where the action doesn't have to be short-term, where there is enough structure built in part around inefficiency, we can start thinking about the design of social systems that take digital networks, that take sharing, that take these kinds of things for granted. Right? Sometimes that means reconsidering ancient habits, as with figuring out what privacy means in social networks. Sometimes it means redesigning existing institutions, like coming up with a new bargain between individual and group effort in educational institutions. Sometimes it will mean the formation of absolutely new institutions, doing things like taking on the environmental movement. Right? There's a very interesting effort going on right now called Transition Towns, which is essentially a recipe for doing my thought experiment. Right? Get a group of people together and figure out how, a bit at a time, right, to convert your whole town or neighborhood to the idea of lowering energy costs. Right? And this is, I think, the design challenge that we're heading into. Right? Society is not just the sum of all its individual members. It's also the sum of all of its groups. Right? We have done an amazing job of handing over a high degree of control to individuals. And the results of that, as we've seen, have been astonishing. The period I think we're entering into is to figure out how to accomplish that same task for group action. Thank you very much.